Hi, I'm Jonathan Prendergast here with Gerald Ahrens. We're directors of Como Energy, working with the Yarra Valley Community Power Hub. This presentation is around the development of community solar car park shading projects with battery storage and EV charging. This particular presentation shows just an example case study of some preliminary work we did at a site in Healesville. We passionately believe in these projects for several reasons, but we acknowledge a lot of community energy. The great work they do is hidden on rooftops or in fields, and we think these can be great landmarks to conspicuously show the great work of community energy groups, and also very timely in terms of EV charging is on the EV adoption is on the rise. People have range anxiety or fear that there's not enough places to charge, and people have fear of coming certain places if they don't think there's EV charging available. This slide is around more targeted about what we suggested to the host site, the benefits that they would get from hosting an EV charging station with solar car parks in their site. They would include weather protection, heat. Returning to a car that's 60 degrees can deter customers from coming on hot days. Getting more visitation, EV drivers more likely to come to your business if you've got EV charging there, and it supports local jobs and economic development. And any in a local community that are hesitant about getting an EV, these sorts of landmark sites with solar car parks and EV charging might help meet that objective. On the energy side, when there's peak holiday rush, will we have enough power capacity to supply all this EV charging? And that's the beauty of coupling it with solar car park shading and battery storage. So this is the site we looked at. You can see the car park there. We were looking for a space that wasn't shaded by trees and had a clear run. Solar car park shading becomes more cost effective if you can do a single longer run. That's all right. And you can see in a moment, the next slide, Area A. Area A is about 34 car spaces, and we found could fit 100 kilowatts of solar car park shading. We also looked at B and C, and B had a bit of tree shading. We could angle it to the west to avoid the tree shading, but it would get less generation because it's slightly south, and C, the blocks were too small and trucks do pass by there, so a bit of a tricky spot.
When it comes to solar car park shading structures, what typically comes to mind is relatively large steel structures that you might have seen in some sort of larger supermarket car parks pop up around the country. And it is great to see them being used rather than putting shade sails up, put something up that has a dual use. And as you can see on the roof of such a solar car park shading structure, you might be able to fit about 100 kilowatt across about 40 car parks. Now, we actually are passionate about another angle in this, and that is, if possible, and that is something we're exploring at the moment, we would like to look at timber structures. Here on the right-hand side, you see a very iconic EV charging station in the UK. It's probably not optimized for solar deployment, but it's an absolutely beautiful structure. And we want to explore whether, rather than using steel structures, you could actually also use timber structures to provide solar car park shading structures. The benefit there is, of course, that you have a lower embodied carbon than in steel structures, which is a key driver for us to pursue this avenue in these projects.
Interestingly, Gerald started investigating that 2 or 3 years ago, and now he's finding the timber structures are cheaper than the steel structures because steel price has gone up so much in recent times. Yeah. In terms of cost, we looked at 2 options, behind the meter and in front of the meter. In front of the meter means going straight from the solar car park, EV charging and battery storage system out to the local network and creating a new grid connection. Behind the meter means going into the host site switchboard, providing that power behind the meter. You can do the metering separately in either of these circumstances using a child meter and setting up an embedded network if you're behind the meter. But it's more this cost of grid connection that changes things the most. 100 kilowatt solar car park, $220,000. the STC rebate for solar panels, the grid connection, battery storage. Because we need there to be decent revenues on the project to sustain the administration of the asset over time. We suggested a greater solar storage system, a bigger one. We're thinking 2 fast chargers and 16 slow chargers. Fast chargers are great for people who are sort of passing by, need a 30-minute quick top up, and then they're moving again. But not necessary for people that are coming to shop for 1 to 3 hours or go to a restaurant and staying around a bit longer. AC chargers are about $2,000 each, whereas DC fast chargers are about $55,000 each, if just added onto all this infrastructure. Project management costs and legal costs to set it up, adding to around $500,000. So how could you finance it? We broke it up into 3 sections. One is around the solar generation and storage, and that could be financed based on that solar generation and storage, supplying either to the host site, to the EV chargers, or into the network, or a combination of those things. That could be funded by the host, or community finance loan to the host, or community owned, sold by PPA to the host site for their consumption. We think the strata who own the car park should chip in for the shading benefit. You see shading structures go up at other car parks. So in lieu of that, a small contribution for the shading. EV charging, we've got a couple of concepts there. That could be community investment. You own the EV chargers, you see them installed, you earn revenues from charging people's cars, or using crowd equity finance like we are on Grong Solar Farm. And we believe that EV owners would be keen to finance new EV chargers and own them, because they get a return on investment in terms of financial, but also that increased utility by having more chargers to use in their neighbourhood. A similar concept in front of the meter, but we found it was unviable on its own 2 feet and would need grant funding. We don't see that as a problem, because we think there's plenty of grant funding around for great projects like this, whether it's in the next 6 months or further down the track. What we do think is important is to not sit and wait for grant funding. You're much more likely to get grant funding if you've taken some steps in the development process, like you've secured property arrangements for the site, a license in this case, from the strata to deploy the car park shading. You've got planning approval, grid connection approval, you've got a contractor on board who can deliver it at a certain price. These sorts of steps prepare you much better to be ready to go for grant funding and provide them confidence that the project will be delivered. So we think it's a really interesting concept, hasn't been done yet, and Como Energy is very keen to support community energy groups, develop projects like this that can support the transition to solar power storage and electric vehicles. And we think that once one of these gets up and delivered, there'll be huge demand across the country and amongst communities for more of them. Any final comments, Gerald?
Yeah, I can just echo what Jonathan just said there. I think the demand ultimately for these type of structures, if you can standardize them and roll them out really easily, will be absolutely enormous. They will be very iconic assets, and they should ultimately be relatively easy to deploy. But they're a novel type of asset, so it'll be interesting to see the first one go up. Our contact details are on this final slide.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.